All right, so here we are, video number 8. I originally thought I'd be able to knock out this series on Heidegger's origin of work of art in 6 videos. Alas, I failed, right? You know how I am. If you've seen any of my other videos, this should be no surprise by now. This video, I got to warn you, just like the last one, it's a difficult part of the essay. It's probably one of the most difficult parts of this essay, where he gets talking about truth, especially the stuff about the clearing. And so I'm going to try as much as I can, just like I did in the last video, to make it as clear as possible. No pun intended. But anyway, we talked about, this is a bit of a recap. I've got it on an old slide from the previous video with the little deer pictured here in a clearing in the woods. But again, sort of just dive right in. Okay, so Heidegger's going to say that generally there's this field of being, all these beings that are, and within this field of beings, some beings that we can know, some beings that we can grasp, some that are out of reach, there opens up what he calls a clearing, right? So this is sort of, maybe I'll just go ahead and reread this quote. And I said in the last video I would talk about the nothing, which we scarcely know. I did not fulfill my promise, so I'll have to do that here and address it right here at the beginning. But let's go ahead, let's just reread this quote, right? So again, normally being is, we're encountered, there's a sort of give and take, some we can know, some we can master, etc. And yet, beyond what is, this sort of space of all that is, not away from it, but before it, like standing before it, there is something else that happens. In the midst of beings as a whole, an open place occurs. There is a clearing, a lighting. Thought of in reference to what is, to beings, right, to all these different things that are, this clearing is in a greater degree than our beings. Okay, I dwelled on that, I think, enough in the last video, what he means. Why? How is the clearing more? How is it? It has more being in or it is in a greater degree than all the beings themselves. Okay, you can review the end of the last video for that one. This open center is therefore not surrounded by what is. Rather, the lighting center itself encircles all that is, like the nothing, which we scarcely know. Okay, and again, so this needs explanation. I will explain this, and then we'll move on to the new quote, the next quote. What is he talking about here when he refers to the nothing, which we scarcely know? And how is the clearing like this? Fortunately, if you're taking my class and you've went over Nietzsche, you've got a bit of a parallel in the Nietzsche reading, in The Birth of Tragedy. If you remember the lecture on the legend of Silenus and the problem of nihilism, right? The myth of Silenus, where the satyr is trapped and he has to reveal his divine wisdom to the human being, the king, and he has to tell the human that the best thing for him is to never have existed at all, and the next best thing is to die quickly. Basically saying existence sucks. There's nothing that gives it any sort of meaning or purpose or anything, right? That's Nietzsche right there. But Heidegger, in his essay, one of his earlier essays, called "What is Metaphysics?" Not the introduction to metaphysics. That's an essay I mentioned in an earlier video, but it's a shorter essay called "What is Metaphysics?" And in that, he spends more time talking about the nothing, right? Das Nicht, nichtet, he says, right? The nothing nothings, or the nothing annihilates. Analytic philosophers hate this, right? Famously, was it Carnap, right? Who just said this just meaningless, this sentence, the nothings. We should discredit everything Heidegger says. Let's just read that sentence and he's just a fool. But if you take Heidegger, what he's saying, and Carnap has maybe a good point. Heidegger doesn't need to be, maybe you could argue, this obscure with language. Heidegger's going to argue he does, because of the Western tradition of philosophy. He has to speak in a certain different kind of a way because other terms have been kind of hijacked. But that's a completely other issue I need to ignore. But let's address this issue of the nothing. What is he talking about? How does the nothing? How is it like the clearing? And how does it relate to, like, what I talked about, the Nietzsche, the myth that Nietzsche mentions in The Birth of Tragedy of Silenus, right? Well, the nothing is, it is this experience that we have for Heidegger, when things fall apart, right? When the world that we inhabit kind of breaks down. So things fall apart. There are different scenarios when this can happen. Things break down, like maybe we have a career path that falls apart and we have to completely reevaluate our whole life. Or maybe we fall in love with somebody and we are engaged to be married. And for us, that was the meaning or the crux of our existence in our world. And then we lose that person, right, by a tragic event, or they run off with someone else or something like that. But nevertheless, in those moments of total despair, this is when the nothings, right? When we see the world and things are there. It's not that like everything's gone, but it's, if you've ever had this happen to you, if you've ever been like really depressed, maybe you've had your heart broken, and it's not that you're aware that the world's there, but it doesn't hold the same urgency, right? You're like, you go to work, but you're kind of like, all you're doing is thinking about how much you just don't care about anything really. All your friends are like, oh, I'm glad that person, they're jerks. I can't believe they left you. You're so much better than them. And, that kind of, and it's sort of like they're trying to be nice, but it doesn't really, it's just, you're kind of nihilistic. You're kind of like, it doesn't matter. Now, eventually you're going to get out of this, right? But that's the nothing, okay? That's das Nicht for Heidegger. And we've all, if we've experienced loss, or even in the introduction to metaphysics, I think he mentions boredom and success even, right? Sometimes when you succeed and you get what you want, you feel the nothing, because you get this thing and you're like, well, I thought when I got my degree and I got my career and I finished that I would be like done and fulfilled and everything would just kind of work itself out. But I'm still kind of not satisfied, and I'm not it's not what I expected, right? And then you sort of reflect, right? Das Nichtet, the nothings, right? And again, you come back into this sort of getting lost in your, you start to care about other things, and you're not so mopey and whatever, and the nothing is gone, right? So that's what he's talking about, the nothing which we scarcely know. We only catch glimpses of this nothing in these moments, right, of defeat or even triumph sometimes, oddly enough, for moments of boredom when we're just kind of like, well, I don't care about anything. Geez, what's the world got to offer? There's a similarity between this experience of the nothing and what he's calling the clearing here, right? So it's an open center that is not a thing, right? It is surrounded, right? It's not surrounded by what is. It encircles all that is. Okay, so yeah, for Heidegger, the nothing, at least, he focuses this, again, if you want to hear more about this, maybe I'll do a video on it if there's enough interest and I get like a million subscribers and become some like YouTube sensation. Yeah, right. But anyway, what is metaphysics? In that essay, he says something similar to Nietzsche, right? For Nietzsche, remember in the Nietzsche video on the legend of Silenus, for my students, they'll know about what I'm talking about. If you don't, you can go watch the video. It's up on YouTube. That urge, like that challenge by Silenus, that nothing matters, right? You should just die, right? That's what's best for you, right? To never even exist, right? Well, the world has no meaning, you silly human, right? The nothing that is something for Nietzsche that is the impetus of why we create art. And for Nietzsche, he thinks of art very broadly, right? Remember at the end of the Birth of Tragedy, at least the part that we covered, you start talking about science as a kind of aesthetic appeal to Silenus, right? No, Silenus, look, science gives us an answer. We find truth and certainty, and we can have technology and useful things. I mean, ultimately, Nietzsche thinks that science is not really going to be that satisfactory for most of us, right? Ultimately, it's not going to provide us with a passionate existence, and it's not going to be a good enough answer to Silenus for most of us. But yet it is a response to that nihilism, that urgency, that nothingness. And same thing here, right? For Heidegger, the nothing, not really here so much, but as in his earlier essay, What is Metaphysics? The nothing is the impetus for why we have a world. Why do we seek purpose? Why do we have structures? Why do we interrelate? It's sort of like trying to avoid the fact that like ultimately we're going to die someday, and we're all like, our life is so small in the grand scheme of things and nobody knows what's beyond. And it's a very unsettling fact. And so we create art and religion and music and poetry and science philosophy to try to give meaning to that purpose. It's a response to the nothing. And again, the clearing itself is like that too. It's a sort of substructure. It's always there. You know, like Nietzsche would say that Dionysian substructure, that sort of call of nihilism that Dionysia, that Silenus poses to us with that terrible truth. You should just not exist at all. The clearing is a response to this, right? And it sort of it encompasses everything, right? Just like the world is something that is a response to the nothing. I need to sort of go ahead and jump into this because I think I've said way too much about the nothing. It's not that important, I think, here to his essay, right? He focuses again on the clearing itself. The clearing itself, he says, which can only be as a being if it stands within and stands out within what is lighted in this clearing. Okay, sorry, let me back up. Let me see. So he ended by saying that the open center, right, this clearing, it's not surrounded by what is, but rather the lighting center itself encircles all that is. Okay, so the clearing makes it, in the last video, I used the metaphor of the clearing in the woods. If I'm walking through the woods and I'm in the thick brush and in the thick wilderness, I can't make heads or tails, right? It's all just chaotic, right? It's just blurry, you know, brush and twigs and trees and shrubs and, you know, a little bird flying by, and it's just this chaos, right? Just metaphorically. Then I get to the clearing and I'm able to, there's a sort of lighting and everything's separate, and I can see all these different particular beings in their being and sort of see them as significant. You know, there's a similarity here in the clearing, right? So it's a lighting center that encircles all that is. That which is can only be as a being if it stands within and stands out within what is lighted in this clearing, right? So I can only see the animals in the woods once I get to this open space, and I can see the squirrel running through the clearing, and I can see the butterflies fluttering about, and I can see the flowers separately and the trees and each individual tree. Whereas before, when I was in the thick of the brush, it was all just this sort of, you know, I was immersed in it and I was lost in it. So only this clearing grants and guarantees to us humans a passage to those beings that we ourselves are not. You know, we're able to distinguish ourselves from those things outside of us, right? The squirrel that's trotting across and the, you know, the tree and all that. And to access the being that we ourselves are, right? To understand our place in things and our purpose and how we navigate this field of possibilities, right? Thanks to this clearing, beings are unconcealed in certain changing degrees. That term unconcealed, in this video, we're going to have to elaborate on that quite a bit. This ties into what we've already talked about before, this notion of truth as unconcealment, as disclosedness. The Greek term is aletheia, right? Opening up, unconcealedness, showing, shining forth. So thanks to this clearing, beings are unconcealed. We can see them as they are, right? In certain changing degrees, right? We see them in a certain light. I see the squirrel scurry across, but maybe I don't see the back of it or the other tail end of it. Or I don't see its guts, but it's lit in a certain way. Each being we encounter and which encounters us keeps to this curious opposition of presence, and that it always withholds itself at the same time in a concealedness. The clearing in which being stands is in itself at the same time concealment. Now this is what makes this part of the essay, I think, super difficult, and this is what analytic philosophers, I think, hate about Heidegger, right? Not only is this language obscure, but the point that he's trying to make seems paradoxical. It seems completely contradictory. So what he just said here, right? We've got this open space that he's calling the clearing. We have this open space in which things are allowed to be as they are. You can think about it in terms of a worldview or a scientific approach or a religion. It's a filter through which things are allowed to be as they are, right? They count as equipment, or they fit into a totality, a system, a world, you know, in the Heideggerian sense of world. But in this openness, right, when we reveal a certain being as a type of being, at the same time, we're covering something up, right? So there's this unconcealment, there's this openness. Remember in the previous lecture, we were talking about the earth itself is like this. When you know, let me, in fact, let me back up to see if I can find that quote real quick. Oh, it's way back, I think. Let's see. He talks about, okay, I'm not going to read this as a super long quote, but he talks about here in this slide how, we take the rock and we try to sort of crush it open to find out what's within it and to try to uncover the truth inside the rock. But all we find is more rock. And then we pulverize it some more, we find more rock. There's always going to be something that is uncovered. Sure, we learn more about it, but there's also stuff that we don't see. There's also stuff that's still concealed, that's not unconcealed, that's not opened up by this clearing, right? So even though the clearing allows certain things to be and to be in a certain way, it also hides certain things in certain aspects from us as well. And for him, this is absolutely unavoidable, right? So he says this clearing in which beings stand is in itself at the same time concealment. Concealment as refusal is not simply and only the limit of knowledge in any given circumstance, but the beginning of the clearing of what is lighted. But concealment, though of another sort to be sure, at the same time also occurs within what is lighted. One being places itself in front of another. The one helps to hide the other. The former obscures the latter. A few obstruct many. One denies all. Here, concealment is not simple refusal. Rather, a being appears, but it presents itself as other than it is. So Heidegger here is distinguishing between two senses of the notion of concealment, and he agrees that he believes in both of these. So when he talks about concealment, he doesn't mean it strictly in the sense of what he's calling refusal here, right? Just like the earth is going to refuse to a certain extent knowledge of itself. I can pulverize the stone so much, I can extract it, I can weigh it, I can analyze it. There's always going to be something about the earth, whether maybe not about the stone, maybe geologists know everything there is to know, and we've looked at it from all different angles, right? But maybe not. Maybe there's another use of it. Maybe there's another way of understanding it, another way of appreciating it, another way that it is in truth. Okay, so there's always going to be something concealed just by the nature of the thing, right? So but that's a sort of refusal, right? Maybe we're just not going to be able to know a certain thing because it's outside of our spectrum of knowing. Maybe human beings, because of our light, the limited amount of light spectrum that we're able to analyze or be aware of. Maybe there's something beyond the electromagnetic, who knows, okay? So maybe there's like a eighth sense that we're not even aware of that like other alien beings have. And so they have access to other information we don't. So that's a kind of concealment that's unavoidable, right? Maybe there's certain scientific inventions that haven't been invented yet, so we can't analyze things like a microscope, right? There's no way we could have analyzed, but that's different. There's another kind of concealment, which is also always at play here. It's always going to be at play. Not just the refusal, but a sort of, he calls it a dissembling, as he puts it. I would say deception, right? It's sort of a deceptive concealment. It's not that you just don't understand it because you can't, and it just, it's impossible to know at this point. We don't have the tools, we just, we're not mature enough, whatever, right? For some reason, there's something that doesn't allow us to see something as it is. That's one kind of concealment. But then there's this more deceptive kind, as he puts it. What is places itself in front of another thing. One helps to hide the other. The former obscures the latter. A few obstruct many. One denies all. Here, concealment is not a simple refusal. Rather, a being appears, but it presents itself as other than it is. This concealment is dissembling. If one being did not simulate another, we could not make mistakes or act mistakenly in regard to beings. We could not go astray and transgress, and especially could never overreach ourselves. That a being should be able to deceive as a semblance is the condition for our being able to be deceived, and not conversely. you know, I should probably skip over this last paragraph, but we could maybe push back on Heidegger for this. What is he basically saying? Excuse me. You know, it's basically that the fact that this is possible, the fact that deception, or as he puts it, dissembling, is possible, is what makes our able to be wrong about things possible, right? If a being wasn't able to present itself or be presented in a way uh, other than it is, right? You see it in maybe because of the shadow or the light, or somebody maybe tricks you and lies to you and uses some trickery, right? Or you yourself, just your own sort of biases trick you, and force you not to see it correctly, right? Heidegger says that the fact that that happens, the fact that you're able to be wrong, make mistakes, be incorrect in the sort of traditional sense of that, you know, the sort of, he doesn't like the term correct. The fact that you can be incorrect is based on the fact that this type of concealment happens. Okay, and again, maybe he's wrong. Maybe there's other ways of being deceived. Maybe, and some might say that he's got the relation reversed, right? The fact that we're imperfect beings, and you know we're flawed, and you know we are somehow weak and don't have perfect rational capacities. That's why we're unable to see the truth, right? But if we were perfect, it would all be obvious, right? That's kind of a traditional philosophical way of going about, you know, not all philosophers agree, but, you know, maybe Plato would say something like that. Some of the earlier Greek philosophers, Pythagoras, would probably say something like this. You know, it's our senses, you know, for instance, they're deceiving us. No, but Heidegger's kind of saying here, no. Concealment is just a part of having the ability to have any sort of talk of any kind of beings. Means there's a clearing, there's an opening, there's a sort of light, there's a sort of, you know, and what this is determined by many conditions, right? And this opening is what determines what is, but also in the sense of determining what is and how it is going to cover up certain things, right? So for instance, in an earlier lecture, you know, I already referred to in this video about the rock. You know, you pulverize the rock, you open it, you can weigh the rock on a scale, you know, you can analyze the chemical structure of the rock, and in each of those cases you're coming to a truth of it, like, you know, yeah, the rock weighs this much, yeah, if you open it up it looks like this, that's what's inside, right? You can see all the little granules and sort of how it was developed, and you know, you can maybe study and learn more about it. But in each of those analyses, there's something that is ignored about the rock, right? In order to focus in and be exact and certain about those particular facts, we forget about these other aspects of it as well, right? And we don't just allow it to be a rock, right? As Heidegger would say, it's just to be what it is, right? We're always sort of framing it in a certain sense, right? Through the eyes of this clearing, which we have to do. We have to have a clearing. We have to have an opening in order to distinguish these things as things in their own right. But as we do this, we're covering up. We're covering up certain aspects of those things. So concealment, he says, reigns in the midst of beings, right? In this clearing, right? In this twofold way, right? So just to review, right? There's this refusal, concealment as refusal. I just don't know it because it's not possible for me to know it, right? There's something obstructing me. So it's maybe not my fault that I can't know it. I mean, how could people back in, you know, whatever BC know that germs were a thing, right? The theory of germs wasn't developed until, I think the 1800s or late 1700s. Maybe it was even later than that. I'm sounding stupid, but you know, go look it up on Wikipedia. But yeah, the theory of germs is relatively young in the history of medicine. So, you know, but there's no way that the earlier people could have known. They didn't have some of the scientific devices that could be able to see germs under a microscope, for instance, to sort of confirm the truth of this theory, right? So sometimes concealment is a refusal, but sometimes, again, concealment is in which a being presents itself as other than it is, right? This is a dissembling, as Heidegger puts it. So again, concealment can be a refusal or merely a dissembling. We are never fully certain whether it is one or the other, right? So we're never really sure whether or not, you know, the reason we're missing out on a fact, is it because we can't know it, or is it because we're just shining the light on it in a certain way, right? We're shining the spotlight on a particular aspect of it. And by shining the spotlight on that particular aspect of it, it darkens and obscures the other aspects of it. We don't really know which one we're doing, right? We're never certain whether it's one or the other. Concealment conceals and dissembles itself, right? So this means the open place, right? This clearing, the open place in the midst of beings, the clearing, is never a rigid stage with the permanently raised curtain on which the play of beings runs its course. Rather, the clearing happens only as this double concealment. The unconcealedness of beings, this is never merely an existent state, but a happening. Unconcealedness, truth, is neither an attribute of factual things in the sense of beings, nor one of propositions, right? So he's again attacking this propositional view of truth, this, correspondence view of truth. He doesn't like it, right? He thinks it's based on this more primal, this more basic view of truth as aletheia, as disclosedness, as unconcealedness. That's what the sort of issue is here. And again, there's something that is sort of uncertain and shaky about this otherwise stable ground, right? There's this concealment, and we're never really sure why it's there, right? What is it that's being withheld, right? This reminds me of, Donald Rumsfeld. Most of my students probably have no idea who Donald Rumsfeld is, unless they're, political nerds or history nerds. But, Donald Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense. I think he was Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush. And he got a lot of flack one time when he talked about, in one of his speeches to the press corps, he was talking about, there are things that we know that we know. There are things that we know that we don't know. And there are things that we don't know that we don't know. And people were just like, what the hell is he talking about? He's gibberish, right? But, just very carefully think about what he says, right? Yes, there's things that we know we know. This is obvious that we know 2 + 2 is 4, right? This is, duh. We've known that for a while, right? And there's things that we know we don't know, right? There's, look to physics, right? You want to look at like particle physics and, quantum physics and all the stuff they're trying to figure out there in Switzerland with their neutron colliders, these problems that they're trying to figure out. Rumsfeld was talking about the Iraq War, or maybe it was in Afghanistan. I think it was the Iraq War, but he was like, there's problems we know exist, right? But there's also, there are the known unknowns, things that we know we don't know. And there are the unknown unknowns, right? There are things we don't know, and we don't know that we don't know them, right? We have no idea. And it's because of this concealment, Heidegger would say, right? And sometimes it's because we're not in a position to know them. But sometimes it's the nature of the clearing itself. It's the nature of this open place. And again, Heidegger says this open space is never a rigid stage with a permanently raised curtain. So it's a happening, much like the work of art is a happening, much like truth happens in a work of art. The clearing itself is a place in which beings can be. And it's not a merely existent state, this sort of stagnant state of the world, this stagnant plane of possibility, but it's a shifting, a moving plane of possibility. If you want to stay with the metaphor of the clearing in the woods, right? As the sun makes its its path across the sky, the lighting of the clearing is going to change. So as the history of man moves along and along, the way the clearing is lighted changes. Our conditions change. What is true about our earth changes. And we have to respond to this in a different way through different eyes, different things. So for Heidegger, he says the clearing is going to be pervaded by this kind of twofold concealment, this concealing as a refusal and this concealment as a dissembling. And we're never really going to know kind of what it is. And so this is a space in which, for him, the ordinary is not ordinary. It is, as he puts it, uncanny, unheimlich in German, literally not at home, unhomelike. Unheimlich, uncanny, extraordinary. So why does he say this? Why does he say the clearing? And I guess this ties into this double concealment. It's the ordinary is not ordinary. It is extraordinary. Well, let's read this next quote, and I'll break it down. Maybe this will this will illuminate this a bit. We believe we are at home, right? Remember, that word uncanny is unheimlich, literally unhomelike, but it means uncanny. That's what it really means. But the word in German is unheimlich, which literally could be translated as unhomelike. Okay. So, but again, the clearing is somehow uncanny, right? So we believe we're at home. We believe we're at home in this immediate circle of beings. In a sense, we do feel at home, right? The peasant woman is at home in her world. When she uses her shoes, when she goes out to work the field, she's at home. So she believes that, right? If you asked her, are you familiar with this territory? Do you know your world? Of course, duh. Why are you asking that? Isn't it obvious? Just look at me. So that which is familiar, reliable, ordinary. Nevertheless, the clearing is pervaded by a constant concealment in the double form of refusal and dissembling. At bottom, see, once we sort of like dig it apart, at bottom, the ordinary is not ordinary. It is extraordinary, uncanny, unheimlich. The nature of truth, that is, of unconcealedness, is dominated throughout by a denial. Okay, there's always, at the bottom of it, right? Even as familiar as the peasant woman is in her world, pressed to it, there's somewhere in that moment, just like, I guess, to use the sort of allegory of Jesus on the cross, when Christ looks up and says, "Oh Father, why have you forsaken me?" Right? Even Christ has this moment of doubt, right? So at bottom, the ordinary, right? The nothing is there, right? It's extraordinary, uncanny. The nature of truth of unconcealedness is dominated throughout by a denial. Yet this denial is not a defect or a fault. So Heidegger's not criticizing this, right? It's a necessary element, okay? It's not a defect, it's not a fault, as though truth were an unalloyed unconcealedness that has rid itself of everything concealed. If truth could accomplish this, it would no longer be itself. This denial, in the form of a double concealment, belongs to the nature of truth as unconcealedness. Truth, in its nature, is untruth. Now that quote is a quote that it makes analytic philosophers. Truth is untruth. That makes their hair go on fire and run down the hall screaming, geez, what the hell is he talking about here? This is really obscure. Let's try to see what he's getting at, okay? I think the first half of this should be fairly clear from what I've already said, right? I think I set it up as good as I could. But why does he say truth is an untruth, right? What does this have to do? So you've got this sort of, again, this feeling that you're familiar with, okay, obviously I know what work is. I know my job. I have this sort of familiarity. I don't think about it. I get up in the morning, I go to class, I do my stuff. I don't really sit back and think about the sort of big picture. Occasionally I do, but not really. But at the bottom of this structure, he says, is a sort of denial, right? You're sort of like, I don't know if you want to call it putting the question off. You're sort of delaying the answer to the question of Silenus, but you're sort of just getting lost in your work, in your purpose, and your functioning, and in your world, right? That's nothing wrong with that, though, Heidegger says. It's not a defect or a fault, okay? For him, that's the only way truth can be. It's a necessary element of all truth. You can't get to this sort of unalloyed truth of all this sort of full. That's what philosophy, at least since Plato, you could argue, he would argue, does. Philosophy is trying to sort of unconceal everything, let everything be open and see everything from every angle and every angle of truth, uncover every stone, leave no stone unturned, and sort of have this full account and full mirror of all that is. But for Heidegger, he says that no, the way truth is involves this kind of clearing. One has to open up a space in which we can recognize beings, right? Whether the space is sort of this sort of Greek understanding as physis, as a coming forth, or whether it's a sort of medieval understanding as, you know, it has its being insofar as it's created by a divine being and this sort of structure. Things have their being in that hierarchy, or whether it's, you know, like in a more modern scientific clearing or opening of beings, if it's measurable, if I can calculate it, measure it, predict it, control it, then it has being, right? In each of these examples, there's a sort of openness. There's truths that we get at. There's things that we know that are true and count as factual within these regimes. But all of these regimes leave out something, right? And some, maybe you could argue, leave out more than others, and they obscure more. You know, that's let's probably shouldn't get into that because it get pretty complicated, pretty interesting discussion probably. But the point is that the nature of truth involves a sort of concealedness, right? So truth, as he puts it, in its nature is untruth. When we allow beings to show themselves in a certain light, there's a sort of falsification. There's a sort of covering up, right? So in that sense, again, truth is, as he puts it, untruth. So this denial in the form of a double concealment belongs to the nature of truth as unconcealedness. Truth in its nature is untruth. So, you know, Heidegger, again, he's not saying here, let's not be confused. This is where the analytic philosophers won't even, you know, they probably wouldn't have even got this far in the essay. But if they did, they would just slam the book on the floor and run out, right? But he's not saying what they probably think he's saying. He's not saying truth is falsehood, right? He's not, that's sort of a, you know, straight contradiction. I suppose truth is untruth is also kind of a contradiction too. But what does he mean by it? What is he really saying? He's not saying that truth is false, truth is falsehood, but rather he says that concealment is always an essential element of unconcealment, right? So if we think of truth as aletheia, which he thinks we should, this is sort of the more basic primal, this sort of opening up, this presencing of what is present. Hate to use that language, but that's kind of his sort of Heidegger speak. This presencing of what is present, this coming to being of what is. Part of it involves a sort of concealment. This unconcealment, this disclosedness, this aletheia, always involves it, right? This is a great quote by Gandhi, right? Truth and untruth often coexist. For Heidegger, they always coexist, right? You know, they are the condition of each other, right? Good and evil are often found together, says Gandhi, right? I think that Nietzsche would maybe agree with that. Heidegger is famously sort of silent about morality and ethics and good and evil, besides the comments he makes in essays like this, where he talks about the work of art as presenting different types of moralities. But whether or not which one is correct, Heidegger tries to kind of stay aloof in most of his work and in most of his philosophy. But anyways, I think this is a good place to stop. I think I'm already getting at like the 40-minute mark. So we better just kind of shut up here. In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about Earth and world. You saw that last slide I got there, and tie, you know, together this notion of truth. And hopefully by the end of the next video, really bring it back into the realm of art and how this all ties together: truth, work, art itself, truth as aletheia, and ultimately what makes an artwork a thing, and how is it a thing? What's its thingliness? We've already got it at its workly character in previous lectures, right? Its workly character is its presenting of this strife between world and earth, right? It sets up a world and it sets forth the earth, right? That's its workly character. That's what makes it a work. That's what makes it work. But its thingly character we're going to get at once we sort of finish this investigation of truth as aletheia, unconcealedness, and how it fits in and ties back into the notion of world and earth. So again, thanks a lot for sticking around till the end of the video. Having a good time with this. I think I'm having too much of a good time with this. Hopefully I can keep it a little bit more brief in the next couple lectures. And I'm thinking, again, 2 more videos, we should be able to finish everything. 3 tops, please, you know, be patient here. But hopefully when it's done, this really obscure thinker, Heidegger, will become a lot clearer to those of you who have taken the time to sit through all this stuff. So again, thanks a lot, and I hope to see you on the other side. Cheers.